A woman hides her newborn in the reeds of the Nile. If the wrong person finds him, he dies. She has no other choice. That child would grow up to defy a king, part a sea, and change the course of history. This is the story of Moses from the river to the wilderness, and the Exodus that still echoes today. The Hebrew Bible describes a people enslaved in Egypt, building store cities and laboring under the Pharaoh. The text says the king, fearing their numbers, ordered every newborn Hebrew boy thrown into the Nile. One mother kept her son hidden for 3 months. When she could hide him no longer, she placed him in a basket of bulrushes, sealed it with pitch and bitumen, and set it among the reeds by the riverbank. His sister stood at a distance to see what would become of him. The river that was meant to swallow Hebrew sons would now carry one of them toward the palace. What happened next would shape the fate of 2 nations. An Egyptian princess came down to bathe. She saw the basket, sent her maid to fetch it, and opened it to find a crying infant. She took pity on him. The sister stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The princess agreed. So the boy's own mother nursed him until he was weaned, and then he was brought into the palace as the princess's son. She named him Moses. The meaning of the name is tied in tradition to drawing out of the water. He grew up in the house of power, educated in the ways of Egypt. He had the privileges of a prince. But the world outside the palace, the brickyards, the crack of the taskmaster's whip, the people who shared his blood was not forgotten. That tension would one day force him to choose a side. When Moses was grown, he went out among his people and saw their burdens. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. He looked this way and that, struck the Egyptian and killed him, then hid the body in the sand. The next day he tried to stop 2 Hebrews from fighting. One of them turned on him. "Who made you a judge? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Moses knew the deed was known. Pharaoh sought to kill him. Moses fled. He left Egypt and settled in the land of Midian. There he married Zipporah, tended flocks for her father, and lived for years in the silence of the desert. The text gives no date. Historians still debate which pharaoh reigned, and when an exodus might have occurred. The Bible does not name the king. For Moses, the desert was both refuge and exile. The man who had once lived in the palace now slept under the stars. But that was not the end of his story. One day he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to the mountain of God. There he saw a bush that burned and was not consumed. He turned aside to look. A voice called his name and told him to remove his sandals, for the ground was holy. The voice identified itself as the God of his fathers of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and said it had seen the suffering of the Hebrews in Egypt and heard their cry. Moses was to go to Pharaoh and lead the people out. Moses resisted. Who was he that Pharaoh would listen? Who was he that the people would believe? The voice promised to be with him and gave him his brother Aaron as a spokesman. Still, Moses asked for a name to give the people when they asked who had sent him. The answer has been debated for millennia. I am who I am. Moses was given signs to perform, his staff becoming a serpent, his hand briefly stricken with leprosy and restored, and was told that Pharaoh would not let the people go easily. The text says that the Lord would harden Pharaoh's heart so that he would multiply signs and wonders in Egypt. What followed was a confrontation that would push Egypt to its limit. Moses returned to Egypt with his brother Aaron. They stood before Pharaoh and demanded that the Hebrews be allowed to go into the wilderness to worship. Pharaoh refused. He did more. He increased the labor. Straw was no longer supplied for bricks. The same number of bricks were required. The people blamed Moses. The narrative then describes a series of blows against Egypt, often called the plagues in tradition. The Nile turned to blood in the account. Frogs, lice, flies, disease on livestock, boils, hail, locusts, darkness fell in sequence. Egyptian magicians could imitate some of the early signs, but soon they could not. The narrative says that at the plague of boils they could not stand before Moses. Each time Pharaoh seemed to relent, then hardened his heart again. The text attributes this hardening sometimes to Pharaoh himself, sometimes to divine action. The final blow was the death of the firstborn. The Hebrews were instructed to take a lamb, per household, slaughter it at twilight, and mark their doorposts with its blood. They were to eat the meat roasted, with unleavened bread and bitter herbs, with sandals on and staff in hand ready to leave. No bone of the lamb was to be broken. That night the destroyer passed over the marked houses. The narrative calls it the Passover. The Lord passed over the doors of the Hebrews. The event would be remembered in an annual feast that continues to this day. In the palace, the firstborn of Pharaoh died. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and told them to go. The Egyptians urged them to leave quickly. After a long sojourn, the book of Exodus gives a figure of 430 years. The people moved out. The text says they left with silver, gold, and clothing given by the Egyptians. They did not leave alone. A pillar of cloud by day and fire by night went before them. The text says they were not led by the road through the land of the Philistines, though that was near lest they see war and turn back. So they went by another way. But the road ahead would bring them to the edge of the sea and the edge of despair. Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. He took his chariots and his army and pursued. The Hebrews encamped by the sea looked back and saw the army. They looked forward and saw the water. They cried out to Moses, were there no graves in Egypt that they had been brought to die in the wilderness? Moses told them to stand still and see the deliverance that would come. The narrative says the pillar of cloud moved between the camp of Israel and the camp of Egypt, so that one side was in darkness and the other in light, and the Egyptians could not draw near that night. The people had time to face what was coming. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. A strong east wind blew all night and drove the sea back and made the bed of the sea dry. The people went through on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The Egyptians followed. In the morning watch, the waters returned. The text says the Lord troubled the host of Egypt and clogged their chariot wheels. The sea came back over them. Chariots and horsemen were overwhelmed, not one of them remained. On the far shore, people saw the dead on the seashore and feared the Lord and believed in him and in his servant Moses. The narrative says Miriam the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a tambourine and led the women in song and dance. The crossing became the defining moment of the Exodus, a story of rescue, judgment, and a path opened where there seemed to be none. Behind them was Egypt. Ahead was the wilderness. They were free, and they were afraid of what came next. If this journey through the story of Moses held your attention, like the video and subscribe for more documentaries that go deep into history and tradition. The tradition does not end there. The people would journey into the wilderness, receive law at the mountain, and spend decades between Egypt and the Promised Land. They would hunger and be given bread from heaven. They would thirst and water would come from a rock. At a place called Meribah, Moses would strike the rock in an act that the text later links to his exclusion from the land. He would see it from a distance but not enter. He would climb Mount Sinai and receive the tablets of the law, the terms of the covenant between the people and their God. The text describes thunder, lightning, smoke, and the sound of a trumpet as the mountain trembled. The people stood at a distance. Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. He would intercede when the people turned to a golden calf in his absence, and the narrative says he pleaded with the divine not to destroy them, and went back down the mountain to confront the rebellion. He would send spies into Canaan and live through the refusal of a generation to go forward, so that the same generation that left Egypt would die in the wilderness. Through it all, he remained the reluctant leader, the man who once asked who he was that anyone should listen, and who ended up speaking to power and to the divine on behalf of a people. His life, as told in the Hebrew Bible, moves from the basket in the Nile to the mountain and the plains of Moab. The Red Sea crossing stands as the pivot, the moment the enslaved became a people on the move, with the water behind them and the wilderness ahead. The Hebrew Bible records that Moses wrote down the stages of their journey. The places named Mara Elim, the wilderness of Sin, Revered, form a map of both geography and testing. At every step the people would grumble, and at every step they would be met with provision and with law. The man who had drawn them out of Egypt would now have to shape them into a nation. If you want more stories like this, history and tradition told with care, like the video and subscribe for more. The story of Moses and the Exodus has been read in synagogues, churches, and in the pages of the Quran. It has inspired art, music, and movements for liberation. Historians disagree on the Pharaoh, the date, and how much of the narrative reflects events that can be verified. The text itself does not name the king. Scholarly proposals range from the 13th century to later or earlier periods. Some argue for a core of historical memory, others for symbolic or theological narrative. What remains undisputed is the hold of the story. It is a story of identity, power, and the cost of freedom, and of one man who, from the reeds of the Nile to the shores of the sea, was thrust into the center of it all. The child in the basket, the fugitive at the bush, the man who stood between Pharaoh and the enslaved and led a people through the sea. Moses remains central in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The Exodus has been read as history, as theology, and as a template for liberation. Some scholars date it to the 13th century before the Common Era under a pharaoh such as Ramesses II. Others place it earlier or treat the narrative as a later composition. The text does not settle the question. It tells a story, and that story has done its work for millennia. From the Nile to the Red Sea, one man's path became the foundation of a tradition that has outlasted empires. The rest is memory, and it is not over yet. From the whispers of the Nile to the roaring walls of the Red Sea, The boy born to be a slave became the man who led a nation to freedom.